Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. I want to talk about this episode focusing on an important part of the history of the Cold War, which was the Sino-Soviet split, which is basically China and the Soviet Union. Both communist countries, both were competing for the head of the Communist Party, especially after 1953. The perception that historians get was that the Soviet Union and China were fully unified during the Cold War. That was not the case, not at all. In fact, China and the Soviet Union actually were bigger enemies at times than the United States and the Soviet Union were. And that impacted relations between China and the Soviet Union, but it was a beneficial situation for the United States to benefit from because they were not fully united and not fully unified. How did this happen? Well, we have to start with the history of Communist China. In 1950, following the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong, who became the dictator, takes power in China. Now, at that point, Joseph Stalin was the head of the Soviet Union. So they quickly established a treaty of friendship which involved a $300 million loan from the Soviets to the Chinese, return of land from the Soviet Union to China, which was the Chinese Eastern Railway, and a 30-year military alliance. Now, in this case, while Stalin and Mao were seen as partners, they did not fully trust each other. Stalin saw Mao as annoying, and Mao just did not like to be seen as the little brother to Stalin. So they ended up clashing somewhat, but their issues were but they were somewhat similar as well. China modeled their economy similar to the USSR. However, there was a little more changes as well. There was changes from the agricultural society to more industrial, which is what exactly Stalin's 5-year plans were. Also, Mao's great leap forward. However, Mao wanted to focus more on social economic conditions rather than having to go more, because it was very different. Mao viewed Marxism, communism differently in Asia compared to the Soviet Union model, and that caused a lot of friction between Mao and Stalin. Now, the Korean War. In Korea, if we've studied the Korean War, North Korea invades South Korea, and the United States went to war and was moving with the United Nations, was moving north to almost invade all of Korea, but then Communist China sent their troops down and eventually had a stalemate at the 38th parallel, and that war still technically goes on today. Now, at that point, the USSR was reluctant at first to support Kim Il-sung, who was the North Korean dictator, who became the North Korean dictator but was really the champion of North Korean communism. But eventually the USSR, Stalin decided to let Kim Il-sung come in and occupy all of Korea, and with the attempts of having a buffer state in Asia. Now, Stalin did not want to send in Soviet troops to North Korea because he did not want to have a full-fledged war with the West. The Soviet Union at this point was very concerned about their image. They did not want to have another war, having just fought Nazi Germany 5 years earlier. They did not want to get involved in another war. However, Mao sent in troops, but only after Stalin agreed to technically support North Korea. And as a result, that was one of the few times that the Soviet Union and China supported each other in a war, particularly a war against the West and the war against the United States. Now, in March of 1953, Stalin dies, and Khrushchev takes power. Nikita Khrushchev becomes the next premier of the Soviet Union. Now, Mao, while he and Stalin did not like each other, Mao respected Stalin. Now, they respected each other, their communist beliefs, how they treated their citizens, how they approached situations. There was a mutual respect between Stalin and Mao. And Mao very much mourned and respected Stalin after his death. When Khrushchev takes power, Khrushchev denounces Stalin in 1956. The de-Stalinization speech in 1956, which caused friction amongst Mao. Mao was very much into the cult of personality traits that Stalin had, and as a result, it caused a distrust between Mao and Khrushchev. The Soviet Union also favored a peaceful coexistence with the West, which the West is particularly the United States, Europe, Western Europe, and this angered China a big deal because China ended up seeing the USSR and the United States establishing world domination between them. China, at the same time, was supporting third world countries as well. And in many ways, China still does to this day. There was the Hungarian Revolt in 1956, in which Mao favored an early crushing. Mao wanted Khrushchev to go in to Hungary and crush the opposition, and Khrushchev was very much reluctant to go into another country, particularly a member of the Warsaw Pact, which Hungary was a member of. But Khrushchev, much later, after it was very clear that Hungary wanted independence from the Soviet Union, would not enter Budapest until much later in 1956, and eventually taking down the government of Imre Nagy and establishing a communist government in Hungary that was much loyal under János Kandár, that was also loyal to the Soviet Union. But it also caused division within communist countries. I'm going to talk about that when we return to History Now here on ONTV. Hello, Oakland County. This is Sammy Taormina talking OA Now. In it, we'll talk various stories ranging from the state to Oakland County teams affecting the OAA. Catch us here on OA Now. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I wanted to continue talking about the Sino-Soviet split, which was the split between China and the Soviet Union. Both of them communist countries, but also very important for the history of the Cold War, because the perception that they were not fully unified, because they were both communist countries, that was actually not the case. I want to talk about the division within the communist countries. If we have a map of the communist countries, I want to take a look at the countries that were very clearly supportive of the USSR, of the Soviet Union, which was the Warsaw Pact countries, which was Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Those countries were extremely supportive of the Soviet Union. Cuba was also very supportive of the Soviet Union as well, getting massive economic aid from the Soviets. Also, Vietnam would also be very supportive of the Soviet Union as well. And a couple countries that I noticed that were very much neutral into into the neither supporting China or the Soviet Union. I will go into the countries who supported China in a few. But Yugoslavia, China denounced North Korea. Yugoslavia was under the regime of Tito. Tito was very much anti-Soviet and anti-Chinese. And Tito was very much anti-Stalin in 1948. Stalin wanted to bring him in as a criminal, and Tito was able to slide by. And so Tito was not a Soviet fan, nor was he a Chinese fan, because of the support that Mao had for Stalin, and as a result, China would denounce Yugoslavia. Now, with North Korea, if you've watched my episodes on North Korea had a history of playing both China and the Soviet Union against each other for their own gain. Wanted both countries to support them tremendously, and North Korea often played both sides against the other to gain economic benefits for North Korea. Now, with China, surprisingly, one country aided the Chinese, which was Albania. Albania at that point early on supported Stalinism. And that was something that very much Mao appreciated, because that was how Mao wanted to take his approach. Though differences, Mao very much respected Stalinism, and he appreciated Stalinism. And when Khrushchev denounced Stalin, the USSR stopped aid to Albania, and Albania, as a result, denounced the Soviet Union and was supporting China. Also, another country that supported China was Indonesia. Indonesia would also support China, particularly with Chinese influence, and so Indonesia was a major supporter of China as well. Now, China also wanted nuclear weapons. China was in the process of having scientists come in, helping develop their nuclear weapons program. Soviet Union was very reluctant to help them, because they were wondering what was China wanting with nuclear weapons, especially given the process of why the United States and the Soviet Union, in the eyes of the Soviets, are the only two countries that should have nuclear weapons. The USSR did not want to have a nuclear China, especially by its border. So that did not help things either. So also the USSR, Soviet Union, would support other countries, particularly against China. They supported India in 1962 with the Sino-Indian War, which was a brief war between India and China, and the Soviet Union ended up supporting India, which did not make China very happy. And then in 1959, the Soviet Union supported the Tibetan resistance against China in the 1959 Tibetan uprising. Again, that caused further clashes between the Soviets and the Chinese at several conferences, especially in Romania. The Soviet and the Chinese delegations often denounced each other. They often competed over whose communist party was the best. Now, it's very important to understand, too, that the Soviet Union and China were both very much, the Soviet Union took a more European approach. China took much more of an Asian approach, which focused more on, Maoism was more focused on social economic conditions, whereas the Soviet Union was more focused on getting the job done. So there was more of the 5-year plans, with Stalin's 5-year plans, and then Mao's Great Leap Forward. There was constant clashes, and it drove to the point where USSR and China broke diplomatic relations. Big reason for this was Mao criticized the Soviet Union's backing down in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. China wanted to see a nuclear war, wanted to see the Soviet Union attack the United States from Cuba. And thankfully, that did not happen. China also accused the Soviet Union of colluding with the United States. And that drove further friction amongst the Soviets and the Chinese. Also, China was doing a cultural revolution, which we focused on Maoism. But there was attempts to also fix relations between the two countries. But the Soviet, especially after Khrushchev was stepped down and was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who was seen as who was considered a Stalinist, but those relations went poorly. There was always fear of war. China actually condemned the Soviet invasion, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And that was a surprise considering how in 1956 the Soviets were wanting to have this, the Chinese wanted the Soviets to crush the rebellion in Hungary. In Czechoslovakia, the Chinese did not support the crushing of the rebellion in Czechoslovakia. Now, both of them did aid North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But there was always that fear of war between both countries. There were several border wars between China and the Soviet Union. And often there were Soviet troops, massive amounts of Soviet troops near the Chinese border and Chinese troops near the Soviet border. China and Vietnam would later go to war in 1979, in which, again, the Soviet Union supported Vietnam. Now that went to an ultimate stalemate, but ultimately both sides declared victory, and the USSR once again supported another Chinese opponent. China also became a nuclear power, which caused friction not just with the Soviet Union, but with the United States as well. So there was also, as I said, more moves to restore diplomatic relations between the two countries. And slowly but surely, they were starting to fix their relationship. Now, in 1972, Richard Nixon visits China. And as a result, Nixon ends up renouncing relations with the Republic of China, which was Taiwan, favoring relations with the People's Republic of China, which was Communist China. Nixon gave gifts to Mao. Both their wives met, and Nixon visited the Great Wall. And there was a lot of relations between the United States and China, which both countries were able to establish a dialogue with the other. But this greatly concerned the Soviet Union, who did not want to have a United States-China alliance directed against them. So Nixon, after the visit to Beijing, visited the Soviet Union, visited Moscow, and had a similar summit with the Soviet Union as well. Now, in 1976, Mao dies, and China has a different ruler who was very much supportive of Mao's ideology and Mao's beliefs. China also went against the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan. China supported the Mujahideen and also had relations strained with the Afghan communists, who were supported by the Soviet Union. China would also boycott the Moscow Olympics in 1980. Whereas the U.S. and other countries would boycott, other European countries sent smaller delegations. China participated in a smaller Olympic Games in Philadelphia in 1980, So that created China's perception of a lot more favorably in the United States. China would also participate in the LA Olympics, the Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984, in which the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries, with the exception of Romania, boycotted. So both China and Romania sent athletes to Los Angeles in 1984, and the perceptions of China and Romania increased amongst the eyes of the United States. Now in 1989, the Soviet Union condemned the Tiananmen Square protests in China that occurred over there because this was a Chinese suppression of their citizens. At that point in 1989, several satellite states, which was the Warsaw Pact countries, were breaking away from the Soviet Union, starting with Hungary and Poland, and then Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and then eventually Romania, and then East Germany, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Now, the clash between China and the Soviet Union would end in 1991 following the fall of the Soviet Union. For China, there was no more clear competition between them and the Soviet Union. When it turned into Russia, China and Russia established very strong relations with the other, and there was no more competition over who was the top communist party. China still has a communist government to this day, even though it has some capitalistic views. For the most part, they are still a communist country. But the legacy of the Soviet Union-China rivalry was that the communist parties were not fully unified. There was a perception out there that the communist parties were fully unified, that they were gung-ho, standing together against the U.S. That was not the case. They competed for influence. The USSR with Marxism, China with Maoism. The Soviet Union did not just see the United States and the West as a foe. They saw China as well. In the end, though, China is still a communist country. Russia is still trying to establish its influence since 1991, trying to build themselves back as a power. They both have great relations. They're both staunch U.S. enemies, and we'll see what happens going forward. That'll do it for this episode of History Now. Talk to you soon, Lake Orion. Have a great evening.